Thank you all. Thank you very much. I wasn't sure what a suit felt like. But fortunately, when you have a clip-on tie, you don't have to worry about tying it. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I do want to thank our board members who have been diligent for the past year. I want to thank the new members who've joined. I want to thank Ken and Holly, who've done a fabulous job of steering this institution through COVID and have kept us relevant. I hope you can tell that by, for example, from the Tier Suzuki and Mark's speech. These are products of our programs. And it was my pleasure to paint them. I was real nervous about there, you know. She came to see it, her painting, and I said, man, I hope she recognizes herself. And as she said something that's just unbelievably profound to me. And so when you go, if you go through and look at the paintings, think about what she says. She says, finally somebody sees me. It was beautiful, and thank you for sharing that. I also am, and how about Hamdi? I've really never liked yogurt before. But you know, he left some free samples back there. And so I tried them, and Hamdi, you might get me hooked, you know. He said, we've got this beautiful new drink, a Shabani yogurt drink. And so I took a swig out of it, but nothing came out of the bottle, Hamdi. At any rate, once I figured out how to drink it, I'm confident I'm going to be healthy. But we thank you all for coming. S.N. Wright II. I've always admired a guy who followed in his father's footsteps. I congratulate you, and thank you for your leadership here in Dallas and your team. So I have the privilege of presenting the Medal for Distinguished Leadership. And I know the nominee or the recipient extremely well. So one of the signs of a good leader is to be humble enough to know what you don't know and find people who do know what you don't know and listen to her. I mean, I thought I was an expert on foreign policy because I was the governor of Texas, and after all, we have a border with Mexico. The degree of difficulty is a little higher when you're the president. And thankfully, Condi agreed to be by our side for 8 years, 4 as a national security advisor, including 9/11, and 4 as Secretary of State. Condi is an incredibly smart person, well-read, written great books. She, and plenty tough. You know, like, you listen here, Mr. President. One of the key things that was important as you think about a Secretary of State and President is their relationship. Foreign policy becomes very effective when it's very clear to foreign leaders that the Secretary of State is tight with the President. And those boys over in the Middle East knew when Condi showed up that she speaks with authority not only because of her own brains, but because of our close relationship. One of the coolest moments of our presidency and our time in Washington was when we invited Yo-Yo Ma to play his cello at the Constitution Hall. And joining Yo-Yo, that's what I call him, anyway. I mean, it's better than calling him Ma. Anyway. Mr. Ma, was Condoleezza Rice. And when they introduced her, she was unbelievably elegant when she came out and played with Yo-Yo Ma. It was a spectacular moment for Laura and me because of our friendship, but also for the country to see such elegance and power of thought and skill. And so, as Ken mentioned, this award has been given to Bono. I'm trying to think of funny to say about Bono, but Bill and Melinda Gates and Wendy Kopp. And it's my pleasure to bring up here to receive this award our dear friend, one of America's great leaders, Condoleezza Rice.
We'll just hold on to it. Thank you.
Well, congratulations, Condi.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mrs. Bush. I just have to say that time playing with Yo-Yo Ma was also extraordinary for me. You have to understand, I played piano from the age of 3. I went to college to be a great concert pianist. I was a failed piano major. I got to play with Yo-Yo Ma, but I wasn't confused. I knew that I wasn't playing with Yo-Yo Ma because I was the world's greatest pianist. I was playing with Yo-Yo Ma because I was the national security advisor who could play the piano. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Well, you've been a friend to us here at the Bush Center since the beginning. You chaired our Institute Advisory Board. You helped lead our board for our global health work. So thank you for everything you've done for us. I want to pick up and talk first a little bit more on domestic issues, and then we've got plenty of foreign policy to talk about today. To a point that was just made in the previous panel, talking about the strength of our institutions. You look at data across the country and you can see that Americans' faith in institutions is generally down. Yeah. And you can see different responses on both sides of the aisle. Just this week, there are bills being introduced to expand the size of the Supreme Court, so one of our significant institutions in our country. We saw, obviously, on January 6th, what happened there on the other side of the aisle. How do you view sort of what's going on in this country in terms of people's faith in institutions, and then some of the responses that people are thinking through?
Well, I just want to pick up where Paul Ryan, who was a really fantastic speaker, where he left off. I went around the world telling people the key to democracy is that you have to have strong institutions, because people are not always trustworthy. Madison famously said, if men were angels, you wouldn't need government. I think you could say if men were angels, you wouldn't need institutions. And so what the Founding Fathers gave us was just extraordinary, because they gave us really perfect institutions because of the imperfectibility of men. And we saw, particularly on January 6th, I don't know about you, but I was in tears that day to see people storming the Capitol. But then that night, when the Congresspeople and the senators walked back into that Capitol and in an almost boring way certified that election, I thought to myself, what I've been saying around the world is true. Our institutions held. And the fact is, I got down on my knees and I thanked God for James Madison, for Alexander Hamilton, and for Mike Pence. Because at that point, the institutions held. Now, I know that Americans sometimes say that they have no faith in their institutions, but you know, they still vote in record numbers this time. They will still go to court when they have a grievance. There's a very funny thing that people detest Congress, but they like their individual congressperson. And so it says to me that one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that we are actually governing at a level where people can feel the effects of government. It's one reason I'm really a federalist. Push as much as you can down to the states. Pull as much down as you can down to localities and to mayors where people can know their governance and feel it. And I think we will get through with this. And through this, I'll say one other thing. We need to stop telling Americans that their institutions are lousy. And we especially need to stop telling kids that their institutions are lousy.
Yeah.
We need civics education where people can appreciate American institutions, not because they're perfect, but because they are, I think, the best institutions any human society has ever had.
Yeah. You have talked, let's go to this issue of education, because you've talked about this a lot this past year as we've looked at improving racial justice. And you've challenged people to say individually, what can I do? What's my particular role? For you, you've said it's education.
Right.
Why?
Because that is our best intervention when we want to give people opportunity. The fact of the matter is that if you are someone who believes the American mantra that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going, you can come from humble circumstances, you can do great things, there has to be a way for that to be true. And a high-quality education is the way for that to be true. The work that the Bush administration did to try to deal with a line that President Bush uttered, and he maybe doesn't even know this, but it was one of the things that attracted me most to you, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Who are we to say that poor kids can't learn? Of course they can learn. We have countless examples of people who have come from nothing and been able to do everything. But I worry. I worry that K-12 education in particular, when I can look at your zip code and tell where they're going to get a good education, is failing our kids. And I will tell you, COVID has deepened our educational inequalities, and we're now going to have to recover from that. So I was actually homeschooled in first grade because the state of Alabama, in its wisdom, decided that unless you turned 6 before October 31st, you couldn't go to school. I was born November 14th. My educated parents were not going to let me stay home. My mother took a year off as a teacher and taught me. By the time she finished, I was second, third grade in most things. But now think about the kid who's studying at home with schools not open, and California schools have been in this way the worst. These are kids, maybe the parent doesn't even speak the language. The parent doesn't know how to help. Those kids are falling behind because I can assure you that what people of means of doing is that they're making sure that their kids are learning in pods. They're making sure that their kids are finding tutors. They're making sure that all of those ways that you can use the community. There are people who don't have access to broadband. What are they doing in this time? And so COVID is deepening these educational inequalities, and we're going to pay for it unless we find a way for these kids to recover.
We've also seen this inequality, at the adult level too,
Yes,
where
in work.
People like you and I have been busier than ever, and we're knowledge workers.
Right.
It's been easy for us to just keep on going, but that's not been true for everybody.
If you had to go to the restaurant as a waitress or to the shop floor, you're probably unemployed in this period of time. And I know that it was important to deal with the pandemic, but it was hard to watch people like me who could work at home and their paychecks were still coming, not understand the anxiety of small business owners who were losing everything, to not understand the anxiety of people who were unemployed. And so, yes, the inequality of work is also showing up in very major ways. COVID has taken a lot of our problems and put them on steroids for everyone to see. And so now finding a way to recover from all of that, better skills and job training. If in fact work becomes something that some people will do remotely, and I think they will, that gives us new opportunities for how to define the job skills that are needed to do that work. But we don't seem to be mobilized to do it well, and I'm concerned about that.
Yeah. So there's lots to talk about on foreign policy. Let's try and get through some of the hot button issues there. I'd love for you to just sort of talk about what do you think the biggest political risks are today and over the next 5 to 10 years versus, what you were dealing with when you were Secretary of State.
Well, if I could just make the connection through COVID, I want to say one more thing about COVID that connects to international politics. After 9/11, it was understood in the world that that was borderless, and within weeks we had in the UN resolutions that allowed us to track terrorist financing across borders. We had the Proliferation Security Initiative that allowed countries to stop suspicious cargo using each other's intelligence. The global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. I remember in November of 2008, we had the G20 in Washington. We had principles of how to deal with it. The first call that President Bush made was to President Hu Jintao, where China and the United States said, we're not going to exploit this situation. COVID has been absolutely the opposite. It's been my PPE, my vaccines, my population, my travel restrictions, and it's been the revenge of the sovereign state, and the international system has been pushed aside. Now, if we are ever going to get back to the place that we function as a somewhat global system, we're going to have to work on even things like travel restrictions. If you go into an airport in Madrid or in London or San Francisco or Mexico City, after 9/11, everything looked pretty much the same. You knew that you couldn't carry more than 3 ounces. You knew that you were going to go through a metal detector. Now we've got this patchwork that's actually making it hard to start international commerce again. So I think we've got a lot of work to do internationally if we do want to have seamlessness in our global system.
That's a great point, and that combined with a growing isolationist bent in this country, how do you start to turn the tide on that?
And that, you ask me, what is my greatest nightmare? It's that America will not engage. Because I think we can handle any problem out there if the United States is willing to take leadership. But if the United States is not willing to take leadership, it won't be Germany that steps up. It won't be India that steps up. It'll be Russia that steps up, and China that steps up, and Iran that steps up. And so I think we have to start sending signals that even if it isn't going to look like the deep, deep engagement that we had after 9/11 or the deep, deep engagement that we had for the 45 plus years of the Cold War, that America is going to have a role in the world, and it's going to be a role that believes in our values. So we're going to speak out for people who cannot speak out for themselves. We're going to care that no one should live in tyranny, that no man, woman, or child should live in tyranny. We're going to care that there is still extreme poverty and extreme disease, and so we're going to do things like the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief that reached out beyond our borders and saved a whole continent. And when America leads with power, principle, and compassion, there's nothing like it in the world, and we make the world better, and we make the world safer for ourselves. And so if I worry it late at night, it's that Americans say we're tired of global leadership. We say, can't somebody else do it? Well, no. Great powers don't get to be tired. And so we're going to have to find the energy again to lead.
You mentioned China. Other countries that could fill the void. China obviously has significant plans on the economic side to be filling the void. How should we be thinking about engagement with China going forward? You can see what they're doing.
Yes, yes. And when people say the rising power that is China, no, China has risen. So let's lose the past tense, the future tense. It's risen. And unfortunately, it's the first time in our history that we've faced a global adversary, which is a military threat and giant, an economic giant, and a technological giant. Mm-hmm. The Soviet Union was a military giant, but it was a technological midget and isolated economically, right? The Soviet Union never accounted for more than 1% of its GDP in international trade. It was a completely isolated economy. That's not China. It has all of the assets that one needs for leadership. And it is an increasingly authoritarian regime that is pushing its authoritarian boundaries outward. So in 1997, China signed on to one country, two systems vis-a-vis Hong Kong. Hong Kong is now a province of China. There's effectively no difference increasingly in living in Hong Kong and living in Beijing. And so they're pushing the envelope when it comes to the South China Sea. I worry about the aggressive movements around Taiwan. What are they signaling there? And this is a time where America has to be strong. I actually think that they won't attack Taiwan because over 25 years, multiple administrations have built the Taiwanese forces to forces that wouldn't defeat China, but they would exact a price. But out of the Putin playbook in Ukraine, you can make a lot of trouble for Taiwan. Taiwan is an island country that has underwater cables that control just cut a few, or islands that are near Taiwan, nearer to China than they are to Taiwan. Just seize one or two. Do things that keep it below the threshold at which we might respond, but make Taiwan increasingly vulnerable and ungovernable. And if you want a really ugly picture, let's have Vladimir Putin decide that he's going to do the same thing around Ukraine at the same time, so that the United States is tested on multiple fronts. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some conversations like that between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Now, let me say one thing about China. It is still not 10 feet tall. If we are attentive to what we have to do, getting back our confidence in our economy and our people, making sure that the government is really supporting fundamental research in the new technologies that are emerging. As the last panel said, not crippling ourselves economically with over-regulation so that this incredible innovation in the United States stalls. We're going to be just fine because China has its problems too. Authoritarians, sometimes people seem to have authoritarian envy. Have you noticed that? Oh, they build great airports. They are so efficient. Why can't democracies be efficient like that? Well, there are good reasons that democracies are not, quote, efficient like that. But remember that authoritarians are sometimes really efficient at bad policy. So the one-child policy, which was supposed to limit population growth, but a funny thing happened. If you were going to have one child, out in the villages you wanted a boy. A lot of girls disappeared. 34 million Chinese men don't have mates. Can you say social tension? So this is an authoritarian regime brutally and efficiently executing bad policy. Democracy is messy and we kind of don't do things efficiently, but we rarely make those kinds of big mistakes.
Right.
China is also getting old before it is getting rich because its population, it has a demographic bow wave coming at it. And Xi Jinping will overreach eventually. So I want us to be confident, but I don't want us to be asleep at the wheel when it comes to China as well.
Okay, we need to talk about Afghanistan because there was obviously a decision made by President Biden this week to pull troops by this September. And Secretary Blinken went to Kabul today, which is showing a shift. They're moving from having troops on the ground and a military presence to trying to have this diplomatic presence and transition it. Where do you think this should go? And what levers do we still have, especially we care so much about women in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I'm so glad you put the question the way you did, though, Holly, because, look, I know how tough it is to be in there, and I'm not going to try to judge the decision that they made. I will say it wouldn't have been the decision that I would have made, but I'm not facing those pressures. I will say this. I hope that we're doing everything with every lever that is remaining. For instance, what can we do through measures that people can't see, covertly, for instance? What can we do with assistance to the Afghans that is short of military assistance but might strengthen their capacity to, they're never going to control the whole country. It's a vast and difficult country, but at least make it possible for them to hold in and around Kabul. I was glad that Tony Blinken went. Maybe it sent a bit of a signal that, the United States of America is still here. And the one thing that I would say is just stay the course. Just if you're going to pull out troops, don't pull out diplomats, don't pull out foreign assistance people. Try to keep a presence there, because the last thing we need is the Stars and Stripes coming down from Afghanistan in the way that they came down in Saigon in 1975. Mm-hmm. America has still not recovered from those pictures.
Yeah.
And so whatever we do, we've got to find a way to demonstrate that we are who we are. Now, when it comes to the people of Afghanistan, we can't abandon them either. One of the first things we did with the president's radio address after 9/11 was we didn't have the president give it. We had Mrs. Laura Bush give it about women in Afghanistan. And they have made so much progress. Yeah. Girls go to school. Girls who have been able to go to school because of what we did are now in college and are now in the professions. And they're police women, and they believed what we said about the possibility of building a better life. We've just got to find a way not to abandon them, whatever kind of peace deal we try to sign. I think we're going to have to be very careful what we signal. And then you're going to have to, of course, try to get the Pakistanis to finally realize that a stable Afghanistan is better for their interests than an Afghanistan in which they're constantly meddling. I think we need to say to the Russians and Chinese, hands off. And I know he's probably not doing this, but if I could ask the president to do one thing, I would ask him to whisper to Putin and Xi and whomever else will listen. We may be leaving, but we do know how to come back. Because if people believe that we will let Saigon happen, they will hasten that. Mm-hmm. If they understand that we are committed to Afghanistan, they might think twice about trying to destabilize it.
Yeah. So I want to ask about a smaller country, but one that has seen significant backsliding lately in Burma. We have a leadership program for young leaders in Burma, and obviously the coup there has been, we've seen democratic backsliding around the world, yes, and this is a very recent example of that. How should we think about engaging in a place like that, where it's not a major superpower, but we still have, a role?
Well, we do, and one thing that we should really do is we should engage India about Burma, as well as the Europeans about Burma. We need international coalition here. The Chinese will not play a favorable role there, unfortunately. But you see people still in the streets in Burma. It's not dead in Burma. And sometimes you have to have the long view that if you can continue to water these green shoots that are there, you can continue to give people a way to connect to the outside world. Don't abandon them. Invite them to conferences. The junta wants to give the impression, because they liked having fewer sanctions, they want to give the impression that, this was just for purposes of national security. Take their word for it and say, okay, so then let your people travel to the Bush Center for our conferences. And I take this from the way that we dealt with Poland after martial law was declared in 1980-81. We stayed with Poland. Ronald Reagan stayed with Poland. And do you know how he did it? He continued to support solidarity through the underground. And it was minor things. It was like in the days printing presses so that they could keep sending out leaflets. And do you know who his two biggest allies were? It was Ronald Reagan, it was the Vatican, and it was the AFL-CIO. And together they kept solidarity alive. And when the conditions were right then in 1989, solidarity was able to reemerge. During the whole Cold War, the Soviets had signed on to something called the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and it had a human rights basket. And the Soviets signed on because they wanted to do the security and economics. They never realized what a Trojan horse it was, because these East European dissidents would leave the country and they would meet people around the world. And when Eastern Europe, they were there. So I would say in places like Burma, to an even greater extent in places like Turkey,
Right.
and even in places like Russia. Keep the contacts to those people. I worry a bit, even with Russia, that some of the sanctions that we are putting on, I don't mind sanctioning Putin and his cronies, but I had a student that I trained at Stanford. We had something in the 90s called the New Democracy Fellows. We trained PhDs from Russia and Eastern Europe in the social sciences, because the social sciences had been so polluted by the Soviet Union. And I trained 2 political science PhDs. One of them became the vice chairman of Skolkovo, which is the Russians' attempt to do a kind of Silicon Valley innovation. He can't get his people to the United States right now because of the difficulties of getting visas. So somehow between punishing Putinism, punishing Erdoganism, punishing the junta in Burma, you have to keep the connections to people, because you never know when conditions are going to be right for them to reemerge.
Yeah. So I'd love for you to give us an example of something that was completely unexpected or surprising that you had to deal with as Secretary of State. I mean, you kind of know what some of the major issues are coming into the job, but what was just totally came out of the blue?
Muammar Gaddafi. The Libyans gave up their weapons of mass destruction, and yours truly was sent to Libya, to Tripoli, as the first Secretary of State to go there since 1954. I was supposed to open up relations. And as I was getting ready to go, I started getting messages from other foreign minister colleagues and from our people. You do know he has a crush on you, don't you? Okay, well, now this was a surprise. So I went to Libya, and we were to have dinner. Actually, the meeting was sort of pretty normal, actually. And then, although he had kept saying we should meet in his tent, I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it didn't sound good. And so I said, oh, no, we'll meet where you meet other diplomats. So we met in his house. It was fairly normal. Then we had dinner in his kitchen with his daughters. People say were really his bodyguards because he didn't trust men, because he'd overthrown people in a coup. So he wouldn't let my security detail in. They're out there apoplectic. I said, look, we're not going to have an international, I can take care of myself. So I go in, we have dinner, and he says, I have a video for you. And I thought, oh no. So he takes out this video, and it's quite innocent. It's me with Putin, me with Hu Jintao, but it's set to a song that he's had written called Black Flower in the White House. And I think to myself, okay, this is really weird, time to get to Algeria. And I thanked him very much and left. So that was probably my most surprising encounter.
I always love that question, because you hear something new, right?
Yeah.
Unexpected. Okay, well, President Bush talked about his close relationship with you and how meaningful that was in your role as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. Talk about what attracted you to working for him.
Yeah. Well, what attracted me to working for then Governor Bush was that he really understood America. And he believed in America and then what America could be in the world. Some of our earliest conversations, you'll remember, were really about education and about immigration and about what made America special and what could we then carry into the world. And the first thing the President of the United States has to do is to have a sense of the essence of who we are and why that matters for the rest of the world. And that was what really attracted me to him. We also had this great event where we met with Vicente Fox in Dallas. Vicente Fox, who had been a governor in Mexico, was now the elected president of Mexico, but not yet in office. Governor Bush had been elected, but not yet president of the United States. And he had surprised me, President Bush had surprised me with saying, you know, we're going to start with the neighborhood, right? If we're going to start with the neighborhood. And so we talked to the Mexicans. They had a whole way of thinking about U.S.-Mexican relations that had everything to do with kind of modernization of NAFTA, to immigration, to democracy in Latin America. And it was just terrific. And the first leader to visit the White House for a state visit was Vicente Fox on September 8th. And then September 11th happened. Mm-hmm. And I always felt that if we had had the opportunity to push that agenda forward, we would be looking at a very different relationship with Mexico. We would be looking at a very different immigration situation. But it was that really attracted me, was that sense of what America could do. He was also, as you could tell up here, really, really funny. Yep. We found the same things absurd. You know, I can't take people without a sense of humor. It just grinds you down. And he had a great sense of humor, and we would laugh at the same things. And he was a man of faith. And I'm a Presbyterian minister's daughter, and my faith is enormously important to me. And so that and great values and the great family. I believe that families matter, because I was lucky to have a great family. And Mrs. Barbara Bush told me once, she said, you know, once you're part of the Bush clan, you're always part of the Bush clan. I've kind of felt that way.
So you've got a lot of, you know, when you look at your resume and when people write about you, there's always a lot of firsts that show up. You're one of the first 2 female members of Augusta National. Yeah. You were there last weekend. You were the first Black woman Secretary of State. You were the youngest person to be provost at Stanford. How have you approached sort of being the firsts in some roles that are pretty significant and that people have eyes on that?
The thing to remember about firsts is they didn't set out to be firsts. I remember talking to Sally Ride, my great friend who was my neighbor at one point, the first woman in space, and she said, you know, I didn't want to be the first woman in space, I just wanted to be in space. And so if you spend too much time thinking about the fact that you were the first, you will forget why you're really there. Now, I understand that it is something that, you know, people say, well, little girls can see, and that's all great, and I don't mean to dismiss the importance of having firsts. But I also think it's important to say to people, you might be the first. So when people say, in order to do that, I have to see somebody who looks like me, right? If I'd been waiting for a Black female Soviet specialist role model, I would still be waiting. And my mentors were actually white men. In fact, they were old white men. Those were the people who dominated my field. And so I think it's great to think about first, and it's great to think about what they do for people coming after. But the most important message is that you do what you love, you do what you're passionate about, you try to be good at it. As my parents would have used to say in segregated Birmingham, Alabama, you try to be twice as good and you'll beat them at their own game. And if you do those things, I think you'll be successful, and at some point you might be a first, but maybe you won't dwell on it too much.
Yeah. Well, Secretary Rice, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations again.